Hello and welcome to Commissioning Podcast episode number 5. Today I'm very happy to do an interview with my special guest, Alan Mills from Falcon Global. Hello, Alan.
Hello, Thomas.
Alan Mills specializes in commissioning and startup and is a subject matter expert in systems completion, operating as an auditor, advisor and trainer. He is a chartered engineer and fellow of the Institute of Marine Engineering, Science and Technology. He is currently serving as a chairman of the Gulf Coast branch in Houston, Texas since 2012. Alan created Falcon Global Ltd in the UK as a startup 2000, then spearheaded the market launch of 2 successful software products. First, PathMaker in 2005, followed by Zenator in 2010. He then went on to develop business on 5 continents, producing worldwide sales revenues of $40 million, with blue-chip customers that include Chevron, ExxonMobil, Anadarko, PDO and others. His 35-year career in the oil and gas industry, much of it spent working internationally in US, Europe and Southeast Asia, has been mainly focused on CSU. He is passionate about increasing process safety and helping companies to be successful in the way their projects are completed. His influence was proven with outstanding achievements on major capital projects in Algeria, Angola, China, Hong Kong, Indonesia, Kazakhstan and Nigeria. Alan, how did you start your career in commissioning?
Yes, my background in the discipline of systems completion through commissioning and startup, or CSU as I'll call it, goes back a long while before I started my company, to my time as a young engineer with Brown and Root in the Brentfield, the Shell Brentfield on the Charlie platform from 1978 to 1980. I was actually with the Brent Charlie platform in Stavanger and stored in Norway, and I was in the first crew on board when it was deballasted to the seabed in the summer of 1978. My job at the time was platform structural engineer, and my work scope was actually effectively completed when the final set of heavy lifts were performed in the summer of 1979. So I then transferred to work in the commissioning team. There I learned the basics. I learned the ropes of how to do systemization, for example, markups on P&IDs, and what systems completion was all about. I was introduced to the check sheet process and the certification process. I played a very hands-on role as a young engineer in the team that completed all of the systems that make up, for example, water injection, the first priority on that platform, followed by main oil export and metering, and then I became involved in gas compression. During my 2 years working on the Brent Charlie platform, I became very well aware of the risks and dangers we faced just to do the job we'd been assigned. For example, about a year after I'd been working offshore on the platform, in the end of July 1979, there was the Sombra air disaster. The Brentfield, for those who don't know, is about 150 miles northeast of the Shetland Isles, and Shetland is about 250 miles north of Aberdeen. So our normal mode of transport was to take a fixed-wing flight between Aberdeen to Sombra in the Shetlands, and then take, and that was with Shell's special charter company called Dan Air. They flew no-frills twin-turboprop Hawker Siddeley planes, which each carried about 40 passengers. And then from Sombra, we would get into helicopter, like an S-61 or a Super Puma. Normal timing of my rotation meant that I would be heading north to Brent Charlie while the opposite shift went south for time off on the beach. For reasons I can't really remember, my shift changed, and I had been at home for about a day or so when I heard about the air crash. It came on the news. 17 people died that day. And I knew most of them because many of them were from the back shift on the platform. And quite a few of those guys I was really friendly with. In those days, we would only really get our news by TV, newspaper, and radio. There was no other medium, and of course, word of mouth. I remember not long, literally hours after hearing about the air crash, maybe the next day, I remember getting a knock at the kitchen door, and and seeing a silhouette. And I opened it and I nearly fainted, because it was actually a guy who I'd been looking for news from, but I hadn't received any news. And he was standing there. He was due to be on that plane, but he wasn't. He told me that for various reasons, personal reasons, he hadn't been able to take that flight. And so I was really pleased to see my good friend that day. So that was one of the incidents I recall very vividly. Another time, and this may be more as well known or more well known, it was the night that the Alexander Keeland, a semi-submersible drilling rig, went down with the loss of 123 lives in the Ekofisk field. I remember it vividly. I was in the Brent field and I'd finished my day shift, or rather my long day shift. It was 15 hours. And I remember it was a foul night as we crossed the bridge to go back to the rig I was staying on that was moored alongside. And I was taking a shower before bed, and somebody in the washroom blurted out, just mentioned that the Alexander Keeland had gone down. That was a long way away, but nevertheless, it really resonated very strongly with me. We were staying at the time on a semi-submersible platform, semi-submersible rig called the Treasure Hunter, moored up to the fixed platform called the Brent Charlie, but actually moored off on the northeast corner of the platform, and bridge disconnected at the time was a rig called the Henrik Ibsen, and it was a sister rig to the Keeland, and it was providing additional accommodation because we were at peak manning at that time. We were bridge connected because we were in a slightly more favourable position, but the Ibsen wasn't, and it was, like I say, a sister rig, so it was for all intents and purposes identical to the Keeland that had been lost at sea. I can actually vividly remember that particular storm lasted several days, and I can remember watching the waves from time to time crash over the bridge of the Henrik Ibsen, which would have meant that those waves were cresting about 30 meters above sea level. In other words, these were what were known as a 100-foot wave. And at the time, people would talk about this like it was a rarity, and it was a kind of a once-in-a-lifetime event. But I remember seeing storms like that several times each year for those 2 years that I worked on the platform. In September 1980, I quit my job and I went to study for a BSc honours degree in civil engineering at Trent Polytechnic in Nottingham. On graduating, I rejoined Brown & Root and went to work in Collier's Wood, which is down in southwest London, in the offshore structures department. And at the time, I was designing steel jackets for BP Ula and the Marathon Bray B jacket. I was actually seconded to join the BP team as the designer's rep, working on site in Cadiz, Spain, at the Dragados yard for the construction of the BP Ula quarters jacket. Because I'd had 5 years prior experience to taking my degree, and that was also working with Brown & Root in places like Scotland and Norway and Holland, I was actually soon able to become chartered. That was something a status I'd been looking to achieve as soon as possible. And that was in 1985. And around about the same time, I joined Shell, working in Lowestoft in Suffolk as project structural engineer, and went straight onto the Lemon F&G project. Because of my previous commissioning experience, I stayed with the Le Mans F&G project. F&G was Foxtrot and Golf platforms through the commissioning and startup phase and through final handover to operations. And I must say, I thoroughly enjoyed everything I did. And I believe I developed a really good rapport with operations. So I was very pleased when I was actually transferred from projects to work in operations. And I must say, until that time, I thought I was actually pretty good at CSU. I thought I'd learned a lot and we'd done great work. And everything we did was just great. But my word, did I get a surprise when I was shown around everything that we'd handed over to operations. And I have to tell you, it was a very humbling experience. And my next 6 months or more was spent fixing leaks and production bottlenecks that we'd left, planning and executing shutdowns to do the debottlenecking and doing things like removing strainers and other temporaries that we'd left in. It was actually Piper Alpha pretty much gave shape and purpose to the way I've approached my career from that moment on. Piper Alpha was in 1988, of course, and it was on the 7th of July 1988, the morning after the Piper Alpha platform exploded, that I was due to go offshore to start a summer shutdown campaign in the Le Mans and indefatigable fields. The work we had been planning had been done meticulously over the winter months beforehand. On that day, I was due to take a crew of 15 guys offshore in 2 early morning red-eye helicopters to begin a sequential series of shutdowns on 3 or 4 platforms. The evening before, I was fairly convinced I would only get a handful of people on those 2 flights. Would people turn up late or not at all to make the check-in? Later on, just as I was getting ready to turn in to get an early night, I checked in to watch the late night news, and it was announced that Piper Alpha was on fire. There had been many explosions, and many people were feared dead. By the morning, the newspapers on sale at the heliport showed all of those dreadful scenes, which I'm sure we're familiar with. All of my crew, all of them, were there, and each one was stone cold sober. There really wasn't a lot to say, and we all sat alone very much in our thoughts, and we got on the flight. Not a great deal was said at all until we arrived offshore on the Le Mans Sea platform about 30 minutes later. Normally, when I would arrive on a platform, I would talk to the OIM and the ops crew, and then talk about what we were planning to do and such like. On this particular day, it was somewhat different. Everybody was very, very focused on what had happened with Piper Alpha. And in the drill, I can't precisely remember what it was that we said, but it was along the lines that everybody's going to really adhere to the permit to work procedure, for example, and being aware of all isolations and inhibits and follow the lockout tagout procedure, and contribute to job safety analyses and toolbox talks and so on. I have to say, normally the guys I would have been able to tell would be faking it in the room. But this time, there was nothing like that. Everybody was really on a very high sense of high alert, and many questions being asked by everybody on all sides of the room to make sure that everything we were going to do on that shutdown would go safely. But I have to say that shutdown on the sea platform and the 2 more I did which followed on later in that summer, were absolutely textbook in their execution. Nothing serious went wrong on any of the shutdowns. We didn't have any injuries, and we didn't fake the statistics either. There were no incidents, and there were no schedule overruns. And I came back from that thinking, why couldn't it be like this all of the time?
Oh, serious experiences, what you have there. So, Alan, another question from our listeners, and to answer for our listeners, what is completion and what is commissioning, and what is the difference? Because I know sometimes people who are not so really involved into commissioning, they mix up a lot of these terms.
Okay, so what is commissioning? Simply put, the definition of commissioning is the process of bringing a machine or an item of equipment, a facility, a building, a ship, for example, into operation. Of course, we include in the definition the process of what takes place during commissioning for that machine or piece of equipment, facility, building, ship, or whatever it is, to be put into operation, and how this is achieved. Within the oil and gas industry, all of the major operators apply a form of commissioning, which, when you look at it from far away enough, would look nearly identical to the human eye. And it's only on closer inspection that you can discern the actual differences. And we do need to go deeper to know what is meant by commissioning. So for a very long time, most of my career, in fact, the art and science of commissioning had not been formally recorded or been part of any engineering degree course that I was aware of. Actually, that is a strange phenomenon, given that every complex infrastructure project worldwide will require to be successfully commissioned and started up in order for it to be handed over to the final end user. At a personal level, and I know for many engineers, the commissioning and completions phases of a project are arguably the most exciting times in the life of an engineer, when the plant is being made ready for handover to the ultimate end user, which for most cases is operations. So looking for a description of what it is that we do, one of the best definitions I've found is from a company in Maryland in the United States called Complete Commissioning. I've actually just substituted the word facility for their word building. So to take their definition, commissioning is the process of planning, documenting, scheduling, testing, adjusting, verifying, and training to provide a facility that operates as a fully functional system per the owner's project requirements. The goal of the commissioning process is to enhance the quality of the delivered product by focusing the design and construction team on the owner's goals for a functional and energy efficient facility. The earlier a commissioning provider is involved in the project process, the greater the chance there is for the commissioning provider to influence corrections without increased costs later. Now, that's a little bit long-winded and wordy, but I do think it really covers every aspect. We nowadays have an API, American Petroleum Institute Recommended Practice, 1FSC. That's, to give it its full name, it's American Petroleum Institute Recommended Practice number 1 for Facilities, Systems, Completion, Planning and Execution. It's still in its first edition. And they say that commissioning comprises activities undertaken after pre-commissioning to verify dynamically that functioning of systems and subsystems is in accordance with specified requirements, and to verify as accurately as possible that the system or subsystem is ready for startup. So it is very strange that the name given to the process of verifying a project has been fully completed, checked, tested, and started up, handed over to operations, does not have its own university bachelor's degree or postgraduate degree course. And it's even more strange when you consider that the commissioning phase defines the way a project is completed, whether that project is seen as a success or a failure. In fact, if you were a financial investor to a project, a successful commissioning phase would be a powerful signal to predict whether the expected rate of return will ever be achieved, or in the opposite case, that an unsuccessful commissioning phase is an indication that the payback period will be longer than expected and the forecast rate of return may never be achieved. So I'm personally very grateful that the introduction of API RP1FSC within the oil and gas sector, at least, giving the real meaning of systems completion and what commissioning is all about, is now available for us. And I'm very, like I say, grateful for the clarity that they have provided in that slim publication. There are many changes, but also similarities. The commissioning and startup of facilities has become considerably more complex over the last 30 years. For example, while the number of commissionable systems on a facility, say on an onshore gas plant or an offshore oil and gas production platform, would be broadly similar to what it was in the 1970s or 80s, there's been a dramatic increase in the number of commissionable tagged items, specifically in electrical instrumentation and controls. In addition, the duty of care placed on operators in all countries around the world, developed or developing countries, plus the need for compliance with regulatory requirements have combined to make the commissioning and startup of a facility a hugely complex business. With many operators and contractors employing CSU professionals in senior roles such as a director role or a vice president, it seems now well understood that commissioning and startup is no longer regarded as a subset of construction. However, there are some factors that were critical in the 1970s and 80s, all those years ago, and remain so today, irrespective of the project's complexity. And these are the absolute need for preservation, tightness, and cleanliness. Every commissioning manager for any project, whatever its size, location, nature, or industrial sector, must recognize the importance of these factors and the consequences of not doing so.
So, and what is systems completion?
API RP1FSC defines systems completion as the process through which the technical integrity and design of a newly built facility is verified and the new facility is turned over from the project to the asset owner or from the contractor to owner. So onto the relationship between systems completion and commissioning, we can think of systems completion as the engineering discipline that commences from the earliest stages in the project lifecycle and includes all of the commissioning and startup activities through handover to operations.
Alan, you developed two software products. One was Zenator. What was the reason to develop Zenator?
Well, I'll try and give you the short version on that one, Thomas. In summary, the primary reasons were to build a tool that would give transparency and visibility to the owner and contractor of a process that at the time was not well understood or clear, and often quite unclear, obscure and confusing. And thinking back a few years ago before Zenator and the current range of products, competitor products, I have to say confusion reigned. Before I started for Falcon in 2000, I'd worked in commercial roles, and that was for a shipyard from late 1990s, 97 to 99, engaged on two lump sum contracts for the conversion of semi-submersible drilling rigs with major structural alterations, upgrading the drilling systems to latest technology, for example. Both of these contracts were totally unclear on the commissioning and completion certification process to finish the project and hand over to the final end users, and neither contract satisfactorily described the commissioning process itself. Consequently, the shipyard successfully used this lack of clarity to great advantage and recovered much of the losses they'd endured during the earlier stages of the contracts. I have to say, had a system like PathMaker, the first version, or Zenator existed at that time and had been widely used, openly used by the ultimate end users and the shipyard, then even in the absence of a well-defined contract, I think it personally is highly unlikely those outcomes and final costs would have been as high as they were at the time on those two contracts. I think, looking back, that Zenator has ultimately fulfilled its basic objectives and gone on to do a lot more besides. For example, it really has brought the transparency and visibility that I'd hoped for. But of course, the true extent and measure of success on any project is and always will depend on the absolute participation and buy-in from all of those taking part, the owner and the contractor side.
Alan, when we prepared for this interview, you spoke about the search for the silver bullet. Can you explain this a little bit in detail?
Yeah, sure. I've sensed, quite particularly in recent years, that many companies feel they're looking for technology to solve all of their problems. And you might shorthand that to say that they're looking to deliver for technology to deliver a silver bullet. I personally sense that many companies are looking for something that will actually avoid them from having to really get involved and get a deep understanding of what systems completion methodology is, and enabling to them to be guided safely through commissioning and startup. I also believe that this search is futile, and I believe it will only lead to actual disappointment and failure. I do not personally believe that any single software product can deliver this misguided expectation.
Alan, what do you think? Who really understands the importance of good commissioning and startup?
Quite frankly, Thomas, I think there are only really two bodies that really understand deeply the importance of good CSU. And one of those, of course, are the professionals that work in CSU at all levels, and the investors, because they understand, they believe that the project will be fully commissioned and started up and handed over, and they will be able to receive their expected returns. So I believe it's really two groups that understand this well.
Alan, what really drives you for the development of Zenator? What was the main reason behind this?
The real drive is beyond transparency and visibility that I talked about earlier. Ultimately, is for increased process safety. I think there is far too little said and a lot less understood about the link between good commissioning and startup with process safety. And that, of course, goes back to Piper Alpha and my experiences there.
So do you think people have to get much more and better training to be able to perform a safe commissioning and startup?
Oh, I do, Thomas. I believe this is experiential and anecdotal. I believe that most people that work in systems completion and CSU have no formal training in the subject. I'm not saying they're not trained at all, just not formally trained in systems completion and commissioning and startup. And in the downstream industry, it's actually a different condition again, because in the downstream industry, which we also operate in, most people in the downstream industry do understand something about commissioning and startup, or restart, usually after a shutdown or turnaround. But in my experience, they know nothing, dangerously little, about systems completion.
So what do you think, how can we do this better? What can we do? Because I also don't know any curriculum, any university where you can educate it into commissioning and startup. So what is your idea?
Well, I do have a series of training courses that I've developed around about the time just before API RP1 FSC was published. These are now called the Masterclass series. So I have training courses which include a foundation course and a leadership course for senior management and investors. And I also have an advanced course, and in time there will be others as well. And these are being run around the world successfully to CSU professionals. That is one thing. I think training is vitally important. I think recognition of the need for training is also vital. I think that training needs to go back to the classroom where technicians and engineers received their formal training in colleges, technical colleges and universities around the world. And at a personal level, I'm taking some steps in that direction. I think in terms of vocational training, I do believe that training standards need to be developed worldwide. I think ultimately that there will come a time when CSU professionals will be licensed. I think within our lifetimes, Thomas, we will think in a few years' time that it is ridiculous that people who would commission and start up a facility like an LNG plant might not be actually licensed. I can see that happening in a few years' time.
Yeah, I think so too. Regarding your training classes, so this is a classroom-style training, what you give live to the attendees?
I do. I do have online modules as well, but actually the majority of the training over the last 6 or 7 years has been in the classroom. So that's, like I say, the initial course was the 3-day foundation course, which is a classroom setting. And I run this for the public. And also I run private sessions as well, which is usually in a project team setting, which might involve people from both sides of the fence, as it were, from the operator side and the contractor side. And it's very helpful to get project teams to meet under those conditions in a neutral environment to talk about things which they almost certainly never would get to talk about otherwise.
So if people are interested in such a training, they can contact you or me, and I will forward it to you, yeah?
Yes, absolutely. Please do. People can find me through LinkedIn. They can find the company through falconglobal.net. They can obviously contact you, Thomas, in terms of email addresses and such like. Masterclass@globalfalcon.net is one, and the other details, like I say, are on the net at falconglobal.net, and also in LinkedIn under my name, Alan Mills, and Global Falcon and Falcon Global. So we're there in 3 places.
Oh, great. I will add all these links into the show notes to this episode, so people can find it easily. One other question, Alan. What impact has a CCMS, a completions and commissioning management system, in regards to the final plant documentation?
CCMS, it should really be regarded as the enabling tool that will ensure that a complete set of the project documentation is handed over to the final end user. The more well-structured and sophisticated that the CCMS is, the easier and more seamless the process of turning over the requisite documentation to the final end user will be. CCMS products that are not so well structured or advanced will struggle, and the entire process will be manumatic. So not all CMS products are developed equally. Customers often need to attempt to source the cheapest CCMS, thinking that this will return the lowest cost. But this is, of course, is false. It's an illusion. Not all CCMS products are created equally. So when deciding on a CCMS, I strongly advise customers to focus on whole life costs through the project life cycle. In other words, to think of the total cost of operation, the TCO as it's also known, and not simply on the price of the product on the box.
So what is your experience with costs in commissioning and startup, or the budget? I know stories when the remaining budget for the commissioning doesn't fit into the project. And at the end, it's always more expensive than expected. So what is your experience with this?
The budget. This is assigned a special place in my foundation course, Thomas. Thank you. But I'll give you the short version here. The budget. Unfortunately, with commissioning, it's a pay now or pay later. Now, that's a very blunt way of putting it, but that is the fact of the matter. And many people, many operators think about the commissioning budget, and their initial reaction is it's too much. And of course, the response there is that's wrong, that's unhelpful. The real issue is finding out how to draw down the commissioning budget and see that the resources are used wisely and allocated correctly to the most beneficial impact and result. And the way to do that, of course, is to start early in phase 2 or phase 3. If we talk about the gated phases of a project life cycle, many people think only about phase 4, the execution phase, but many of the really important decisions and strategy decisions and choices are made in the very much earlier phases of the project life cycle, like I say, in phase 2 and phase 3. So to think and plan really hard and intelligently on how the commissioning budget should be drawn down, which will affect overall the contract and project strategy, is vital. For example, the amount of offsite modularization that takes place and how that commissioning is handled, whether it's all handled back on site or how much of it can be handled off site, and how to minimize the retesting, because that is one of the continuous chestnuts and issues that any commissioning manager will face, how to not continuously retest the testing. So the question on budget, which almost always comes down to a number, whether it's 3% or 5% of CapEx, is important. But ultimately, what's more important is how that budget figure is assigned and drawn down and used wisely to serve the best objectives of the customer and the project.
Thank you very much, Alan. This was great insights in your commissioning experience. At the end of this interview, I have one last question. If you could give just one advice to young commissioning engineers, what would it be?
Well, as you know, Thomas, I have difficulty sticking to just one advice, but I'll try and keep this brief. It's often said that the two most important days in a person's life are the day that they were born and the day they know why. Systems completion in CSU is not a career for just anybody. And it is often said that systems completion in CSU chooses the person as much as the person chooses that choice of career. For those people that do choose systems completion in CSU, I urge you to fully embrace our discipline, to thoroughly understand the methodology and the process, and never forget that every complex infrastructure will require to be fully commissioned and started up before it is considered a success to be handed over to the final end user. Not every project you'll work on will be a tremendous success. In fact, some projects could be the exact opposite and might be considered a failure, but these projects still provide tremendous learning opportunities, particularly for younger systems completion and CSU engineers. You will learn how not to do things the next time, believe me. To short circuit the pain of learning by experience, I thoroughly advise to try formal training on one of my courses in the Masterclass series and really get a kickstart to your career and move the needle.
Thank you very much, Alan, for these last words in this interview. We spoke already about 40 minutes. So it was really great, and I hope I will have you again in one of my podcast episodes here.
Thank you, Thomas. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you very much for listening to this podcast episode. If you want to do an interview with me, just send me a message through my contact form on www.CommissioningCoach.com. Thank you very much. Talk to you soon. Bye bye. Thomas Stünkel.